Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Sarah Toulouse, and I'm the Executive Director at Asset. We're so happy to have you join us. For us as an education improvement nonprofit, being so close to the statistics about pandemic learning loss and how widespread it is, and just even looking at best case scenarios, having students half a grade level behind at the end of this school year, and knowing that national statistics are showing that learners of color will be at an even greater deficit. And so we know the historic windfall of funding is certainly going to help with regard to those topics, but we do need some help in navigating all of the complexities. And so we've been so very fortunate to work with Dr. Caitlin Brennan, who has her finger on the pulse of all of the various funding streams. And so she'll be talking with us in just a few moments. Before we do that, I just wanted, for those of you who are not familiar with Asset, just to give you a quick background on our organization. We were founded in 1994 by Bayer and other community partners to address the issue of science literacy and STEM education. As I mentioned, we are an education improvement nonprofit. We are headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our mission is to advance teaching and learning. And our approach is very specific, and it's rooted in evidence-based strategies such as inquiry, human-centered design, and place-based learning, among other things. We offer a whole suite of services, including professional learning, customized solutions, consulting services, and then we are also fortunate enough to have grant-funded programs. And so while I'm not going to go through all of these for you at this time, just wanted you to have a quick overview, and we've got contact information available at the end of the presentation if you're interested in learning more. Just as a couple of housekeeping items, we will not be utilizing the chat for this webinar. However, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and type that into the Q&A. We will be monitoring that throughout. And then at the end, we will leave time to be able to present Caitlin with those questions. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Caitlin Brennan, who is an education policy consultant as well as a teacher educator. She has her PhD in special education, and she is an all-around subject matter expert in these topics. And so we're so excited for her to be able to spend this time with you. So Caitlin, I will turn it over.
Thanks, Sarah. I need to take you everywhere with me to do my intros, I think. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chat with you all about this just really incredible effort from the Biden-Harris administration to really address, as Sarah was mentioning, not only items related to the pandemic and what we've seen in terms of learning loss and social emotional needs of our children and families, but really we're looking at this as a long-standing effort to kind of respond to how underfunded education programs have been. And we know there's going to be so much need moving forward. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all. This is a lot of information. There's a lot of different funding streams coming. Even the budget, which we'll get into at the end here, is different. It's different than what we've seen in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started. And as Sarah mentioned, please feel free, any questions you have along the way, just send those in the chat and we will get to them. Sarah, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So whenever I talk about education policy and policy in general, I sort of look at these 4 Ps, and I like to set this up to start. So you have the policy behind things, right? But then you have the politics, the players, and the process. And you can't divorce those from one another, right? Those are 4 big areas, especially in Washington, that we look at. And when we're thinking about education policy right now, the politics really matter. So currently, the Democrats control all 3 branches of government. And with that comes some power, right? But they also control it by the slimmest of absolute margins in the Senate. So the Senate is an even 50-50 split, but there is a tie-breaking vote, and the tie-breaking vote happens from the president of the Senate. The president of the Senate is Vice President Harris. So she has already, in her first 150 some odd days in office, made a number of tie-breaking votes. And there's a number of politics that are in play even within the Democratic Party. So right now, progressives and moderates are really divided. Some folks think this is way too much of an investment. Other people think we're going way too small. This is our opportunity to change the game. So it's going to be really important to get the Dems all aligned, because as part of the process, they have a tool called reconciliation that you can use with budget matters. So reconciliation is so typically in the Senate, for something to pass, you have to have 60 votes, which would mean the Democrats would always need to get at minimum 9 Republicans on board with their initiatives. When you use reconciliation, you only need to have a simple majority. So that's how they've been able to move some of these through, including the American Rescue Plan, which is the really large sum of money that we saw that is heading directly from states to school districts and LEAs. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. This gets a little bit into the weeds on it. The Senate parliamentarian decides when that can be used. That is well above my pay grade and area of expertise. I would defer to my colleague, Sarah Abernathy, who's the head of the Committee for Education Funding in Washington. If you're ever looking for a remedy for, if you can't sleep at night, I'm happy to pass along kind of some of the rules in terms of the Senate. But the parliamentarian is the person who decides if this can be used. I would not want to have that job right now. There's a lot of reasons that Dems are trying to push things through in that way. So just keeping all of that kind of to set our framework. Sarah, you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the American Rescue Plan, right? I think everybody's heard a lot about this, but really when we dig into it, it's an extraordinary document. It's an extraordinary amount of money. It's an extraordinary law. So the American Rescue Plan is the $1.9 trillion relief package that was passed back in early April or the end of March. The goal here was to help local and state governments, as well as individual taxpayers and businesses, address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what does this mean for folks who are interested in kids and families? Well, it provides just over about $170.3 billion to education. So this is the single largest federal investment ever in our nation's schools. I say this, but then I feel like every week I get an update of a new windfall of money that feels even more. So state and district leaders now have this opportunity and the responsibility to use these funds to address both short-term needs associated with the pandemic and to invest in structural changes that, over the long term could really fundamentally change the way that schools do business, right? The department has made a very concerted effort to say, we're in this for equity and the whole child, right? So this is something that is the department's very excited about, but like I said, there's a lot of money and there's a lot of flexibility. And with that comes a lot of, there's a lot of opportunity, but it's also a real challenge too. Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, $170.3 billion that's going towards education funding. So just to give you kind of the high level breakdown on this, that's about $125.4 billion that's going to state K-12 public education programs. That's the big pot. Then you have about $39.6 billion that went to higher ed, $7.2 billion for the federal E-rate program. What this does is it helps with reimbursements for broadband access, and $2.75 billion for private schools serving low-income students. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look here at the federal investments in public K-12 since the start of the pandemic, kind of these first two are often referred to as CARES 1 and CARES 2. CARES 1, if you recall, it was passed in the beginning of the pandemic. Really, this was an effort to get schools things like PPE, laptops, so that we could make that really quick transition. I'll never forget that March day sitting there when we realized that this was going to happen, right? And so everybody pivoted very, very quickly. And it's extraordinary, I think, what people were able to do during that time. So you see CARES 1 and CARES 2, as I mentioned, 13.2 billion and then 54.3 billion. You have the E-rate at 7.2. Remember, that's the broadband reimbursement. And then you have this money going to K-12 and ARPA, 125.4. So in total, we've seen from relief efforts alone, take out the president's budget, which we'll talk about in a bit, is $200 billion that's been going to education. Next slide. So this is the interesting part here. How will public schools use their funds? There's not a lot of restrictions on this. So the two big pots here are LEAs get about 109.8 billion. So that's about 90% of the funding, and that will be distributed to districts that's based on your Title I funding. Then we see learning loss time. States must use at least 5% of their ESSER, and sometimes you'll hear this. So the ESSER funds are the ARPA money that's going directly to the schools to address learning loss. And they really are highlighting here supporting the implementation of evidence-based interventions, things like summer learning, extended day, comprehensive after-school programs, extended school year programs, various interventions to address academic, social, and emotional needs. And then specifically really looking at students from families, low-income families, students with disabilities, English language learners, students of color, migrant students, those experiencing homelessness, and those involved in the foster care system. Next slide. Thank you. So if we look here at the kind of the breakdown, so you can see after school programming, that's about a minimum of 1% of the state's funds must be used for after school programming. We saw summer enrichment, again, at least 1%. They put in a chunk for administrative costs so that states don't have to tap into the money that's actually being used for programmatic efforts. So that's already kind of taken care of. So you can use about 0.5% there. And then the remaining state funds, so you see you've got 1%, 1%, 0.5%. The remaining state funds can use these on any allowable use in the act. And we'll get into that in just a moment. Next slide. Thank you. So 20% of the funds that LEAs receive, so that's going to be the school districts, right? They have to address learning loss. And then they have the freedom to spend the remaining 80% of the funding based on, as the department defined it, local needs and priorities. So, and then there's a separate pot of money that also provides more than $3 billion in funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. IDEA is the law that ensures that all students in the United States who receive special ed service have access to a free and appropriate public education in their least restrictive environment. So there's different pots there's 2.58 there to support the school age grants, and then there's an additional 200 million for preschool grants, and then 250 million in grants to support infants and toddlers with disabilities. The only part of IDEA that was left out was Part D, and Part D is the personnel preparation component. That being said, you can use the American Rescue Plan money for anything under, if you go to the next slide, Sarah, anything under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, and IDEA. So those are the major laws that really run education. Those are those big pots of money that are out there that we work on all the time in terms of our advocacy efforts. So this is really important to consider. So you can use that money for any of those uses. And there's a number of folks who are putting out really good information. The Learning Policy Institute is a shop out of Washington, DC. They have a tremendous staff that is just pumping out white paper after white paper on uses and evidence-based practices. I've listed a few here you'll receive this PowerPoint, I'm sure, and you'll have the links that you can click on. So as we have mentioned, things like student learning through extended school year, summer enrichment programs, high quality evidence-based tutoring programs. You can provide students and staff with safe school reopening, things that you need in order to reopen safely that align with the public health guidance. You can use this also to upgrade school facilities for healthy learning environments. But I also am going to touch on the infrastructure bill in a bit, which also allows you to use funds there as well. You can invest in wraparound supports. There's a huge emphasis in this administration on community schools. And of course, stabilizing and diversifying the educator workforce and reinvesting and rebuilding that educator pipeline. We're starting to see this already. We were in a really woeful space in education prior to the pandemic when we're considering things like staffing. And you're seeing it now too, that many districts have invested in these really robust summer programs that are truly fantastic, but they're having a really difficult time staffing them. So I think really, for folks tapping into your partners, your community partners, your nonprofit folks who are able to provide supports and services to the students who districts serve, it's really going to take everyone coming together and working together to get this right. So we have this expansive American Rescue Plan Act. This webinar is quite timely because the plans for stakeholder engagement actually are coming. They're due to the department by the 7th, which I believe is Monday. So after that, you'll start to see LEAs submitting their plans for stakeholder engagement, which you're starting to hear about right now. So you have all of this really great information and funds from the American Rescue Plan, but then we also have an infrastructure package, the American Families Plan, the reintroduction of earmarks, and the $6 trillion budget proposal that was just released last Friday. For a very long time, the work that Sarah mentioned in the beginning. So I do some policy advising work in Washington. I have clients whose members are institutions of higher ed that recruit and prepare future educators. I haven't been in meetings like this in a really long time, where we're just talking about this incredible amount of money that's coming. So just keep in mind that this does get a little bit confusing because there are so many different pots, but they all kind of work together. The difference in, I think, what's happening now and what you're seeing is that school districts are really in the driver's seat on a lot of this. But let me dig in here a little bit on the infrastructure package. So this was a $2.5 trillion package we're seeing 2.5 trillion, and that we have a large chunk of that that's going towards schools. So you can see here 100 billion to repair school buildings. So if you recall, that's also an allowable use under the American Rescue Plan Act. The reason that I highlight this, though, is just as school districts are considering what their funds are going to be used for, keep in the back of your mind that there's the potential for this infrastructure package, and keep in the back of your mind what we had discussed in the beginning surrounding the politics, the policy, the players, and the process, right? If Dems can use reconciliation to move things forward, there's more of a likelihood that stuff will get passed. Again, not quite sure how that's going to go. I don't have any insider scoop on when or how the infrastructure package is going to go right now. It's still a little bit up in the air, but just know this is out there. We have 100 billion too to increase broadband access. We've certainly seen the impact of the digital divide. There's $12 billion in here for community colleges, $48 billion for workforce training, supporting career pathways in middle and high school students, specifically looking at those apprenticeship type of models. And then we also saw $45 billion for drinking water infrastructure, replacing our lead lines, right? And I think this just really highlights the infrastructure package that, one, the Biden-Harris administration is really viewing social infrastructure as infrastructure, and also just how many different policies and different networks tap into education. So that's one part. So that's part of the infrastructure package. And then we have the American Families Plan. So the American Families Plan was introduced at the end of April, and this came on the heels of the infrastructure pack of the American Jobs Plan. And it's a $1.8 trillion package. The big funds that are in here are 200 billion that's going to go towards universal pre-K and 109 billion for 2 years of free community college. So those two programs alone, if it's passed in the form that it exists currently, will add 4 years of free public education for every child in the United States. It's really incredible. We saw 62 billion in there for a new program to strengthen student retention, 46 billion for HBCUs and minority serving institutions. There's a $9 billion investment there in teachers, which includes addressing teacher shortages through expanded preparation, improving diversity, and supporting teachers. We're looking at 225 billion for childcare to cap costs for families that earn less than 1.5 times the state's median income, and no more, that they will not have to spend more than 7% of their income. And then we also are seeing here the expanded school-based meal programs as well. So the White House in this said that these investments, combined with those laid out in the jobs plan, will not only boost earnings, but they'll expand employment opportunities and enable the United States to win in the 21st century. And I have a chart too that I can share with you that breaks down the difference in the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan. So if you're thinking about these buckets, the Jobs Plan touches on community college, school modernization and construction, workforce development, childcare, and broadband, whereas the American Families Plan touches on universal pre-K, community colleges, Pell Grants, college affordability, teacher training, school modernization, workforce development, childcare, and broadband. In addition to all of that, we also have earmarks returning in the federal government for the first time in 10 years. So earmarks are historically what folks have said are used to kind of grease the wheels in Congress. And that's what we say, right? So every member of Congress can put in these requests. And it gets very interesting in the House, especially, right? Because if your members of the House have a smaller area that they're focusing on, a smaller jurisdiction, so they can really tap into what their community needs are. So members will submit their requests for funding. And then what happens is that's part of the budget. So when the budget's then passed, or when the vote comes up for the full budget, members have more of an incentive to work together to get that budget passed, because they want that money going back to their district. And the earmarks have changed this time around. So there was, the one that everybody kind of talks about in DC was this bridge to nowhere. And it was a really, a lot of people looked at it as an egregious abuse of power. Folks were doing things like getting money for their own personal or family businesses or games. There's been a revamp of it with Rosa DeLauro at the head of the Appropriations Committee. They're not called earmarks anymore. They're called, I believe it's community spending projects. Each member could submit 10 requests, but it came in so last minute that most of these are based on what we think of as traditional infrastructure. Here in Pittsburgh especially, there was money that went to bridges and roads, repairing city steps, things like that. But in the future, people have made their entire careers lobbying for earmarks. You could really tap into things. And in other places too, even in this round, we saw things like going towards food banks, homelessness. There was a number of social programs that we can address. So just keep that in mind too, that pot of money is coming as well. Next slide, please. All right, so the big one. So the FY 2022 budget. So on Friday before Memorial Day, I had the pleasure of waiting around all day for the president's budget to be released. And it did not disappoint, other than that they released it on the Friday before Memorial Day at 3 o'clock, so that I spent the next 6 hours reading it. But it's a really phenomenal investment in education. So the FY 2022 budget proposal is a $6 trillion proposal. It provides a 41% increase to the Department of Education. Okay, so will increase the department's funding to $102.8 billion. So that's a $29.8 billion increase to the current funding levels. It is the largest increase in funding that the department has seen since its inception in October of 1979. So I just want to read this statement from Secretary Cardona. He says, this proposal reflects the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to ensuring that student success remains at the heart of the department's work. It calls on Congress to prioritize the physical and mental health of students, close education equity gaps, especially in underserved communities. We need to focus not only on recovering from the pandemic, but also look towards our students' education after the pandemic to ensure there are improved resources to build our education system back better than before. This budget ensures all students have access to high quality, affordable post-secondary education, while also improving career pathways for students of all ages and levels. So the budget is a pretty complex document, and it includes what we call the typical funding recommendations for the next fiscal year, and we see that annually. But it also includes substantial new investments in programs that are reflected in those two massive proposals that we just talked about, right? The American Jobs Plan, often called the Infrastructure Package, and the American Families Plan. So those are both 10-year visionary programs, and those include those education funding buckets that we had talked about before. Now, Congress is looking over these plans now, and they'll negotiate with the White House on the infrastructure bill. So if you're hearing anything about the budget, and when I share out the resource from the department, just know that there's discretionary funding, which is what we see annually and is typical. And then there's also these mandatory spending for education. It's mostly focused on the American Families Plan. So some of the largest funding increases recommended in the budget for this year include $20 billion for Title I, but this is a new equity grant, not the existing state program that you're all probably familiar with. There's $1 billion in there for new school-based health professionals program for the first year of a 10-year campaign. And this was a promise, and when President Biden was campaigning, that they wanted to double the number of counselors, nurses, and mental health professionals in schools. There's a $36.5 billion for Title I grants. This is a $20 billion increase from FY 2021. There's $15.5 billion for IDEA, $11.9 billion for Head Start. That's a $1.2 billion increase. $732 million for IDEA Part C. That's for those early intervention services for infants and toddlers. Excuse me, there's an increase to Pell Grants, an increase to Teach Grants, a number of efforts focused on job-embedded coaching and community schools and partnerships, diversifying schools, fostering diversity in school districts. And I think this was really, a lot of this also is coming because our new teachers that are coming out were prepared in a different way. So in the same way that our K-12 partners had to kind of flip on the dime, so did higher ed. And a lot of our student teachers who were in the field or were slated to be in classrooms doing that good work didn't have the opportunity to, due to COVID and some of the restrictions. So I was really happy to see some of the job embedded coaching and professional development opportunities that will exist for both, for novice teachers, pre-service, in-service teachers, because this was a different type of program to go through. But we know that we're going to see, a lot of these students are probably going to be securing jobs because the teacher shortage is just so dire right now. And Pennsylvania kind of skirted past that, especially Western PA for a while, but it's certainly here now. So as I mentioned, just investments in personnel, professional development, diversity, community schools. And it's really difficult to understate the magnitude of this proposal. Like I mentioned before, the largest increase in federal contribution, especially when we're thinking about students with disabilities. This is one of the first opportunities towards fully funding IDEA. So that was a ton of information that I just threw at you. But the one thing, Sarah, if you can just go to my last slide, that I always say is if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. So it's really important right now. So the budget is not passed. So what happens now whenever the president puts his full budget proposal out is there's 12 appropriation subcommittees that will now get together. And my colleagues in DC have told me that from the Monday after Memorial Day until this budget is passed, they will all probably be living in their Senate and House office buildings just working on this to get it passed. Because if you don't pass the budget, what will happen then is there will be a government shutdown. That's not going to happen. They're going to pass a budget. But it's really important now, I think, to reach out to your members of Congress, to thank them, and to encourage them to vote on this package, to talk about your needs as educators or nonprofit providers or anybody who's really serving youth and families at this extraordinary investment. And then also, I think, just to keep in mind that we can't do this alone. So thinking about your partners that you've worked with in the past or future partnerships, and making sure that you're bringing those folks to the table for conversations and that they're getting to the table as well. Because this is, I think, an opportunity to really change the game in education. So that was a lot of information. So I will pause there and see if there are any questions in the chat. I can't see if I can see that.
If you have a couple, I can start it off with exactly what you just summarized with, and that this is a lot of information. There are a lot of funding streams. And so how will schools access these funds, and what are the processes that they need to be aware of?
That's a great question. And I think that's still being ironed out with the state. So it's not like the school districts are going to just get their, $120 million check and say, have at it, right? States are going to have to submit plans to the state. School districts are going to have to submit plans to the state. My understanding is that checks will be issued monthly based on what your plans are. But in terms of those processes, I think we'll have more information after the 7th once the state departments submit their work. And I'm happy to follow up with you all after that as well.
Are there restrictions on the variety of revenue streams? Are you able to receive money from multiple?
Yes.
Okay.
So the FY 2022 budget, so that will be one that will come down the line. Like I said, that'll probably, I think Rosa DeLauro said her goal is for those appropriations bills to be done by the 4th of July, which would mean that she'll want that budget passed by the end of July. But in terms of, so like that money from the department is just money that's always there. You all already had that. This extra, or not extra, but the relief money is what's kind of that separate add-on. And just the one thing, if I can comment briefly, is, in 2008, we also received a lot of relief money too. And a lot of school districts, I think, are very hesitant about spending this money for anything other than a one-time expense, because then we didn't have, that funding doesn't continue. But I think what I tried to show today is that, this administration is different in terms of looking at the 4 Ps, regardless of your politics. The Democrats do have control for at least another year and a half. So there's going to be 2 years of this possibility for budget reconciliation to get some of these things passed. The money is going to keep coming, at least during that time. But I do think when you're thinking about programmatic efforts, you want to be cautious, but also to know that you can make substantial, sustainable investments for future partnerships within your institutions.
Great. There is a question. Does the K-12 funding include school age childcare programs, and how will it affect those programs which have been operating and taking the brunt during the pandemic?
That's a great question. So the rescue plan money the funds that I talked about today are primarily going to LEAs. So in terms of your child care providers, that is going to be coming through the American Families Plan in addition to the FY 2022 budget. That being said, though, if districts partner with child care providers for before care and after care, the districts could supplement some of their funding that way. That would be an allowable use for before care and after care. And that is a great point. And I think if you are a child care provider, I would for sure be getting on the phone and with your members of Congress just to talk about everything that you've been through in the last year. I think this was something that really exposed, we're seeing the impact of how many women, especially Black and Brown women who have left the workforce to care for their children during this is really just incredible. And schools are kind of the pillar of childcare, right? You get before care and you get after care. So I think that reaching out and talking about that is going to be really, really imperative. But there is that huge investment for childcare in the American Families Plan.
Okay, next question. Will the LEAs have discretion about how to distribute these funds to private schools?
No. So the private schools get a separate pot of money.
Okay, if there's a follow-up question to that, you can go ahead and type it in. A question about how can nonprofits be more involved?
That's a great question. So I think this slide is for nonprofits, right? If you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. I would tap into your partnerships that you have. I would talk about what you can provide for school districts. And I would make sure that you're looking at their strategic plans as well, and how you can enhance that. Like I had mentioned before, there's a woeful personnel shortage. We can put a ton of money into programs, but if we don't have the people, then the programs don't matter. So I think just really thinking about this is a true collaborative effort. And that really is highlighted through the investment that the department has made in community schools. So I would recommend anybody who you have relationships with getting there to discuss these matters. But then also I would reach out to your members of Congress too to say, hey, we provide for children and family. We don't have a direct funding stream, right? Like nonprofits are generally pretty philanthropic based oftentimes. So I would start thinking about maybe how can we think about those funding streams for nonprofit providers that serve children and families in districts. I'm not sure what's going to come from that in the long term, but I do think that's going to be a conversation that comes up because this investment is really looking at, bringing in partners from all over to work with the school districts. And I think it'll be a really unique conversation once this is all, 5 years down the line to see how this all went. That's one other thing that I forgot to highlight too, is that this money can be spent, you have to obligate the funds. So that just means you have to have your plan by 2024, but they can be spent through September of 2025.
Okay, and next question, how does this funding impact our interface with faith-based schools?
So that would fall under the private schools that are, and their funding levels are based on the percentage of low-income students that they serve. So faith-based schools and private schools will kind of fall into the same thing, and public charters are operating the same way. That being said, in the department, the same way that public schools are, the department does have a separate pot of money in terms of FY 2022, though, for charter schools.
Okay. Next question, in regards to Title I, will there be set-asides specifically to increase mental health personnel? If so, when will this come into effect?
In FY 2022, there is, and it can fall under either that's an excellent question, under the Title I grants, or it can fall under that. I think that they're the new school-based health professionals program. And like I had said before, so that's a 10-year campaign that's looking at doubling as soon as, and I don't imagine that's going to change much, to be honest with you. So every meeting I've been in, I mean, that's one thing. So I work with a colleague of mine in DC who works with, they're called specialized instructional support personnel, social workers, mental health workers, school psychs, etc. This has been a promise from the Biden-Harris administration. You've seen Dr. Biden is out, she's been doing her rounds with Secretary Cardona. It's a really big investment. I expect that you're going to see that 10-year plan stick in this budget. So I think there will be a tremendous increase, and I think you'll see it starting in FY 2022. But the thing that's important there is that higher ed needs to recruit people. So this is also, I think, something that I've been thinking a lot about is like, we need to rebrand education. There's been, right now, a lot of teachers are under a tremendous amount of stress. Educators have been under a tremendous amount of stress. We need to make sure that with these investments that we are now able to recruit, prepare, and retain not only a qualified, but a diverse workforce.
All right, I don't have any other answers in the queue. So if you have one on your mind, you can go ahead and type that in. In the meanwhile, we will be sharing the slides with everyone in attendance today. And there are active links throughout Kate's presentation, so you can access deeper information related to all of the topics that she covered. But that said, Kate, there's a lot embedded into your presentation. So if you had to provide guidance or give advice to the folks who are participating today, how should they prioritize their time?
That's a great question. I do a weekly Washington update that is through I think there's one that goes out through Ed Prep Matters, which is through AACTE, and then one that goes out through TED and HEXI. And I kind of break down every week. It's like an insider look into what's happening in the Beltway. But I primarily focus, it will be a lot of special ed focus. So you can always, I think I'm happy to share out my Washington updates for you to check in on. I would really tap into the slide that talks about the allowable uses. There's about 4 or 5 hyperlinks that are on there. The ones from the Learning Policy Institute do a really, really nice job of breaking down some of the allowable uses, some things that they've seen with evidence-based and data that's showing really great success and growth for students. So I would say kind of dive in there a little bit. And then I'll send you the department's budget. It's 60 pages, but I did a brief write-up on that. I'm happy to send that out as well. But if you have any specific questions that you're interested in, I will share my contact information with Sarah to send out. I'm happy to chat with anybody. I think it's just really important too, if there are school district partners on this call, educating your board. So your board will be pretty instrumental in voting on these things. So making sure that they're informed. And then, the departments put a really big emphasis on local needs and priorities. And the way that you know that is engaging with your stakeholders, and your stakeholders are parents and community members and things like that. So I think just really, diving into that as well. But I think that one slide on the allowable uses, I'm happy to give you my link to the Washington updates. And then I can put in the chat, if you can see it, this is my Twitter handle. And I actually do a lot of.
It won't come through, Kate. We can go ahead and send it in.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Sarah will send that out. But my Twitter has a number of all things education policy too. But it's definitely a lot. The department, though, has issued guidance, and they will continue to issue guidance. So they just issued volume 2 or volume 3 of their guidance. I'll send that along to you as well. So that is something that is, it's very user-friendly and easy to go through. So you'll receive that as well.
Thank you so much for your time, Kate, and for your expertise. I don't see any additional questions in the queue, so I think we're at a point where We can close the webinar. Thank you everyone for participating. I will share on screen just a way for you to get in touch with Asset if you have any specific questions for us or any assistance that we can provide you. We're happy to do that as well. Thanks for your time on a Friday during lunch. We know your time is limited and we're so happy you spent it with us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to my new Twitter followers, too.
Okay.
See you guys.
Have a great weekend.